Hello and welcome. This is Peter Bonanno, former Director of Program Development for the Search Inside Yourself Leadership Institute, here to give you an orientation to science for becoming a Search Inside Yourself teacher. So my hope for this program is that you'll have the opportunity to really understand the fundamentals of science in the Search Inside Yourself program and be able to know how to study and learn all the specifics and teach all of the specifics of the science with more confidence. To do that, we're going to explore these 4 areas. Why? Why science in the Search Inside Yourself program to begin with? What? What's the science that's currently in there? And we'll talk about where. Where does the field stand? The field of what we might call contemplative neuroscience. And finally, we'll get down to the most practical aspect of this all, which is how to talk about science. So as we dive in, I want to start by making this distinction, which I find useful. And that is the difference between a scientist and a technician. Now, a scientist is someone who pursues understanding, and a technician is someone who applies technical skill. And I make this distinction because if you're like many teachers in training, you might think, well, science, geez, that's really tough. That's the part that I'm the most intimidated by. I'm really not so sure if I'm going to feel confident in doing that. And what I want to encourage you to consider is that at least the fundamentals of the scientific process and what it means to do science is actually very basic in terms of being a human trait of pursuing understanding. The real challenge comes more in the technical areas then about, well, what are the tools that you use and how do you measure it and so on. A scientist, now a baby is someone who you could think of as being very high on the science side of things. They're pursuing understanding all the time. They're always trying to make sense of the world. However, they don't have a lot of technical skills in order to do this. Now, on the other hand, you might have someone like an oil rig worker, right? They're using a massive technical skills in order to, let's say, operate a piece of machinery, and that might be very complicated and we couldn't do it, but they're not in the pursuit of new understanding of things. Where things get really interesting is when you have people who are very high in terms of their scientific orientation, in terms of trying to discover new things, and they also have really great technical skills in order to conduct these investigations. So here we have a picture of Albert Einstein, someone who is famous for being always curious and childlike and imagining and wondering, and who also over time developed more and more skills that were necessary to put together his great works. Hopefully you can take a bit of inspiration from this yourself and say, you know, if I'm curious, if I'm willing to understand with rigor, I can build the technical skills over time. And we live in a really interesting age, by the way, where really anyone can practice science. SurveyMonkey, for example, is a very simple way to start collecting data. Even in a certain way, a very rudimentary way to collect data is asking for a show of hands in a room, right? It's not the most rigorous method for different reasons you can imagine, but we can already start to think about like, oh, it's a basic process to start collecting data, collecting feedback about the world. There's all sorts of fun wearables that are out there now. This is one I tried out in terms of measuring, I think, breath rate and heart rate. And I tried just wearing it around for a day and seeing how did the measures that this device was giving me match up with my own feeling of how I was feeling throughout the day. And it actually seemed pretty spot on in terms of, I did a meditation at a workshop, and then in the afternoon, driving through traffic, the red indicates you were more like tense or stressed. And then this was a long Tai Chi session in the evening. So there's all sorts of tools that if you're curious about that are out there that you can start using to collect data and start analyzing them. With that preface around science, I want to start talking about then, okay, well, why science in Search Inside Yourself? And I'd like to think of this in terms of the 4 C's of why science in Search Inside Yourself. And I'll start off with the first one that most people think, if I were to ask you, why do you think we include science in Search Inside Yourself? Why is that valuable? Often the first one people mention is credibility. We're going to be introducing practices and mindfulness and emotional intelligence that might be unfamiliar to people. And so having some research saying, hey, this actually works, is going to give some credibility to the program, to you as a facilitator, make it easier for people to just dive in and start doing the practices because they have some trust that it works. The second area, this can be a bit unexpected, but I think is really important, and that is compassion. Now, the idea here is that when we understand that our reactions to things are things that we can study and that we can understand, we can start to have some more appreciation for why life can be so challenging sometimes. Think, for example, of the amygdala hijack. Just the knowledge that when we are in a highly activated, highly aroused state, that it tends to downregulate our long-term executive functioning, decision-making, and so on. That's something that allows us to have an understanding when we see another person experiencing a trigger, that it's not just like, oh, they're a bad person, or they just don't have their stuff together, or whatever it is, but that there's actually a physiological process going on inside them, which is making it really hard for them to do long-term planning, because that's how we're wired. So this sort of scientific understanding, as I mentioned before, the process of science is a process of pursuing understanding. When we pursue understanding about how the mind works and how emotion works, we often find we can have some more compassion for other people and for ourselves. The third why is closely linked to the first, and it's confidence in helping. Now, the idea here is simple. If you're going to be teaching these practices to a room and saying to everyone there, hey, you should try out meditation, you should try out journaling, you should try out self-compassion as a practice, that you have some confidence that these practices actually do work and do make a difference. And the fourth and last one is curiosity. And that is, I often find in teaching the program that in starting to talk to participants about the fact that we can pursue an understanding of how does the mind work, how do emotions work, how do dynamics and relationships work, what are the factors that influence empathy or compassion with other people, participants start to understand the bigger picture, these things that make up my life, like empathy and self-awareness and emotions and thoughts. They're not just set in stone, or they're not just things that like operate in a black box that I just have to take them as they are. I can actually be curious about how they work. Going back to that second point, yeah, there's a great saying by the peace activist and Zen teacher Thich Nhat Hanh that understanding is love. And I think we can think about that in teaching some of these things like the amygdala hijack, that it's not just about proving how something works or sharing about a dynamic for an abstract reason, but we're actually building an understanding of ourselves and of other people. So that's the why. Let's talk about the what. And the what is going to have three components. What is the science in Search Inside Yourself? What is the basis for the claims broadly that we're making? And then what are some of the challenges that are important to be aware of as someone who's going to be teaching this material? First is, what is the science? In short, there's about 24 studies. This fluctuates up and down as new program versions come out. And importantly here, there are two categories that you should look for, and that is some studies talk about mechanisms and some talk about benefits. And in just a moment, I'll highlight the difference between those two. The next thing to be aware of is that while the ingredients of Search Inside Yourself, we often talk about neuroscience, many of the studies come from different fields also. So psychology, organizational development, you'll see different fields of study in there. It also includes meta-analyses. Meta-analysis is a study that is done not just with one group of individuals in one experimental setting, but where it actually collects, let's look at all the different studies that have been done on self-compassion, for example, or all the different studies that have been done on meditation practice, and tries to extract, okay, what are the common themes? Not just this one study said this or that other one study said that, but if you look across dozens of studies, what are the consistent findings? And the general approach in the scientific field is that this is really important. Sometimes individual studies can turn out one-off results, but it's not actually a reliable finding. And you need to do a meta-analysis to understand if that's actually a consistent finding that you can say, yeah, that's how things work. And the studies that are included in the program, we really are looking for two different qualities. The first is that they're true, which is to say they're representative of the field. And the second is that they're useful. and that is that they're relevant to participants. Now, I mentioned a moment ago the difference between mechanisms and benefits. So just to stay with this idea of the amygdala hijack for a moment, if we talk about this, the relationship between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, we're really talking here about a mechanism, showing the output of scientific investigation to explain how does something work? How does the thing work? The second general category you see is a benefit. Still here, we're talking about the amygdala once again, but in this case, what the scientific finding here is geared towards is towards saying, hey, there's an actual benefit that can come of this, having less anticipatory stress, having less unpleasantness, and so on. Now, often these overlap, but it's just important as a teacher that you can be clear when you put a slide up on the screen, are you sharing it with the intention to tell your audience how something works, and or are you sharing the slide with the intention to propose to your audience there's a benefit to the practice I'm teaching you. Let's talk about the basis for claims next. It's important to understand that beneath any particular study, at the foundation of any particular study you'll come across that's connecting the benefits of meditation practices with neuroscientific findings, there's a fundamental understanding about the logic that we can draw. And when you know that, both as a teacher teaching the program and as a teacher reading the studies and trying to understand the science, things will just make a lot more sense. These are the principles of how we infer a connection between cognition or cognitive changes, any sort of change in how we think, how we feel, how we process information, and things that are happening in the brain. First, the brain consists of cells, lots of different cells, but in particular we focus on neurons. And these neurons are distributed in different spaces or different regions and different networks, which is different ways that these cells are linked together. Then we say, okay, 2. We know from earlier studies that certain brain areas and certain networks tend to be correlated with certain cognitive activities. This network tends to be more active when we're processing sensations that are coming from the body. This network in the brain tends to be more active when we're producing speech, and so on and so on. If that is true, then the theory is that we can look for cognitive changes by looking for changes in those regions and networks. And that changes in those regions and networks should coincide with cognitive changes. If we know, for example, from prior studies that focused attention tends to be associated with certain types of brain activity, then if we want to understand, does meditation actually lead to more patterns of focused attention in the brain, we can say, well, we've already established what networks are associated with that. Let's have someone do a focused attention meditation and look for that. If we're curious about, does doing a compassion meditation change the way we process social information? It makes us more open, more kind to other people, more empathetic with other people. Again, we're simply doing the same thing. We're saying, well, earlier studies have found an association between certain networks in the brain and pro-social behavior. So if we want to understand if doing a compassion meditation makes someone more pro-social, we can have them do a compassion meditation and then go and look at those regions that are already known to be associated with pro-social behavior. So you can keep this in mind anytime you're reading a study to understand it better or teaching a study. This basic idea that the scientific process has been one of building up a broader and broader understanding of what networks, what regions, what patterns of activity are associated with what kind of thoughts, feelings, emotions, qualities of mind. And then, because that body of knowledge exists, we can then do different forms of practices and see if those regions and networks change. That's all that's happening in these studies you read. I'll share a little bit about that to make it more concrete. So earlier studies have established that certain brain areas are correlated with certain cognitive activities. Now, the most classic demonstration this you'll often see in like a Psychology 101 class has to do with this guy, Phineas Gage. The story is he was a railway worker and goes to put this metal rod down into a hole to tamp down some explosive powder of some kind. And the thing sparks off and shoots up through his head quite tragically, and yet he survives. However, he survives with a significant portion of his brain, a particular portion of his brain damaged. And the reports went that he was able to, in many ways, perform normal functions, but because there was damage to this left frontal lobe, he had difficulty with inhibition. He started acting more recklessly, he started not being able to control himself, to manage his emotions, and so on. And this was one of the early findings that got people starting to connect the dots about, oh, interesting, so maybe in this brain, this left frontal lobe has something to do with behavior inhibition or emotion regulation or self-control. That particular case, there's a lot of debate and discussion around, but the general point it makes is what we're going for. And this is a second one, just to emphasize the difference in brain regions, language production. So language production can be affected by damage to areas of the brain that are used for producing and understanding language. And just to highlight how in some cases this can be kind of localized and specific, there's two different kinds of conditions that can happen. One called an expressive aphasia. A person who has some sort of damage to this area is going to have difficulty expressing themselves in language. So they're not going to be able to find words or produce language. And yet they might be able to perfectly well understand the language that others are speaking to them. On the other hand, in a slightly different region, you can have a receptive aphasia. And this, again, is going to affect your language processing, but in a totally different way. Damage to this region of the brain might mean that you are not able to understand the language that others are speaking to you. And interestingly, you'll be able to speak language quite fluently in terms of having a vocabulary, having a normal tempo of speech, but the language you produce tends to not have meaning behind it. It tends to just be kind of like a jumble of words that sounds like you're saying something, but there's no actual meaning. So again, this is pointing to a couple of the more concrete examples of how certain brain areas are correlated with certain kinds of cognitive activities. Now, fortunately, we don't have to rely just on chance accidents like these in order to understand the connection between certain brain regions and networks and cognitive activities. We can use technology to do that. And I'm going to point to just a couple of the methods that have been used, especially in contemplative neuroscience. And these are basically finding ways to track physiological activity in the brain and correlate it with certain cognitive activity. The first of these is EEG. EEG, when you see those really elaborate looking headsets where someone has lots of wires strung from their heads and each wire is connected to a little sensor that's against the scalp, that's EEG. And it basically measures surface level activity of the brain. It has very good temporal resolution. In other words, within a resolution of milliseconds, you can pick up on changes in electrical activity. Downside of EEG is that it mostly picks up on surface level activity, and so it's not so great for looking at deeper structures in the brain. EEG was one of the early ways, though, that scientists would try and make the connection between where was activity going on, where was electrical activity flowing, and therefore what were regions of the brain or networks in the brain that might have been active for certain tasks. If you ever see references to brain waves and things like beta waves or alpha waves and things like that, those are studies typically done using EEG. And actually, this has not become so common in more recent contemplative neuroscience studies. What's being used much more and what we feature more in the program is fMRI. So I'll talk a little bit about that. MRI is magnetic resonance imaging, and the F in front of the fMRI is just adding the word functional, which was a later technology built on it. And I'll speak mostly about fMRI since that's the main kind of neuroimaging that's referenced in Search Inside Yourself. fMRI uses what's called BOLD signals, blood oxygen level dependent signals. Basically, the way that this works is when neurons fire, they need energy to fire, they need oxygen. Oxygen, when it's in blood, has certain magnetic properties. And so using functional magnetic resonance imaging, you can pick up on those different magnetic properties and infer where more oxygen is being used. And from inferring where more oxygen is being used, we then make the inference that that's because the neurons in that area are more active, and therefore we make the correlation between what we see from those bold signals all the way to what are the different cognitive activities that are being engaged in while those signals are coming out. fMRI has good spatial resolution. You can get to within a millimeter's range of what's going on in different regions. It's great for looking at structure, looking at function, looking at connectivity. The challenge of fMRI is that it has fairly low temporal resolution, at least at the scale that the brain operates. So for EEG, we're able to look at a resolution within the range of milliseconds, and for fMRI, we're looking more in the scale of seconds. So what are some of the challenges? When we are doing the work of sharing about the science, it's important to know that there are challenges in trying to make the connection between behaviors like doing a focused attention practice and something like a change in the brain. And I'll just cover this really briefly. There's what we might think of as two categories of challenges in practice, doing the work of making the connection between experiences and forms of cognition and the brain. And the second category is in principle. So even stepping back from the technical challenge of how to do it and how possible is it to do it, there's some more almost like philosophical questions about how we approach this work. This framework, by the way, this work is really based on a lot of work done by a researcher by the name of Evan Thompson in particular, who's been quite articulate at explaining the current state of contemplative neuroscience and what the limitations are, or what are the ways it sometimes gets oversimplified. So in practice, we'll talk about the fact that the brain consists of highly distributed networks more than regions in a more like way. When we look at a world map, we can point to very clear regions. Oh, okay, this is this country and this is that country and this is that country. It's not that clear in the brain. Many-to-many mapping, that is that different networks do a lot of different things. It's not just like they do one thing. And the third to know about is just variation, that there is individual difference within individuals' brains, which can make it hard to create an average finding about brains, and that individual brains can change quite dramatically. It's the plasticity element. And the second thing we'll talk about is in principle, even when we see a change in the brain, it's often not as obvious as it first seems to say, what does that change really mean? Okay, so we noticed something got denser or more connected to another part, but what exactly does that mean? And then the second piece we need to look at is that there's a kind of cultural proclivity or bias to how we tend to do the scientific process and how we tend to interpret results. So that is to say, there are some things that we think of as, oh, this is just pure science, pure data collection, pure analysis. Actually, within there are often embedded assumptions about what's good and what's bad, what's right and what's wrong, what's an appropriate response or not appropriate response. And so as you're teaching, it's important to be aware of these where there are cultural influences in the scientific work being done. First is this idea that the brain doesn't consist of sort of little nation states of distinct regions with clear boundaries, but actually more distributed networks. And this was a really beautiful illustration that was done. When we talk about the amygdala, when we talk about it on a slide, we might simplify it and kind of locate it in a particular nub or particular region. But more what we're talking about in reality is a pretty densely and broadly connected network. And so here you see a sort of mapping of all the different ways and all the different regions to which an amygdala is connected to. And we tend to think like, oh, this little bump in the brain is responsible for that, and that little bump in the brain is responsible for that. And it's not actually quite as clear as that. We should be thinking more in terms of networks. The second challenge to be aware of is that when we go to study phenomena and when we go to present about science, we might start to just think of a network as being responsible for one thing. You know, like this is the network of the brain that focuses your attention, or this is the network of your brain that makes a decision or something. But actually, that's not really how things work. And to illustrate that, I want to give a short example. Imagine that you instruct this child, you're going to give a short mindfulness exercise to her, and you say, okay, I want you to try doing something. We're going to put this jar in front of you, and the jar is filled with all kind of glitter and colors. And I'm going to shake it up, and then I'm going to put it on the table. And I want you to practice just, sitting quietly and paying attention. And this is a practice that's often done in schools to begin to introduce focused attention, mindfulness. Imagine that these instructions had been given to this child. And take a moment and think about, what are some of the cognitive abilities that are going to be necessary for this child in order to do this task that you've set forth? What are some of the functions of the mind, the body, the emotions, attention, anything that are going to be necessary? Well, here's just a few that I'm going to share in order to highlight how it can be quite tricky to measure what's actually going on in meditation practice. Well, so first of all, you might have interoceptive awareness. This is awareness of one's own body, right? The instruction is to sit in a certain posture, sit quietly. You've got some awareness of your body and where it is in space and how it's postured. On top of that, maybe there's motor control, right? I need to move my hands and rest them on my thighs, or, okay, I'm going to try not to fidget with my hair. So motor control functions might be active during this time. Language processing, right? So child has just received the instructions, sit quietly and pay attention. Okay, I might be remembering those instructions and thinking about those instructions through language. That might be active. Social information processing. Okay, someone has told me to do this. My parent, for example, or teacher has told me to do that. And what's the relationship I have with that teacher that shapes how willing I am to engage in this activity? Visual processing. Okay, I'm looking at the glitter now. I'm seeing things. I'm maybe focusing on some little glitter bits here and there. Metacognition. Noticing that my attention wandered off and bringing it back to the task at hand. Attention management, right? So, okay, it's wandered off. Okay, I got to keep tracking that. I need to redirect my attention over here now. And maybe emotion management. Maybe as the child, I start to get a little bit bored, or I get excited or whatever, and I'm needing to regulate my emotional state to have the right level of activation that I'm engaged with the task, but maybe not so much activation that I'm, getting anxious or overexcited or something like that. So why do we highlight this? We're talking about the fact that when you do any particular activity, you're not just doing what it might seem on the surface like you're told to do, sit quietly and pay attention, or that task to sit quietly and pay attention might actually involve very diverse different brain networks. We'd prefer to have things be relatively simple and relatively straightforward, but it is important to know when you're teaching this, really there's a lot more going on. And this is one of the reasons why something like meditation is so hard to study. The final big challenge that I want to talk about, or the next to final big challenge I want to talk about, has to do with inference. That is, like, when we see a change happening, we as human beings who are conducting the study or reading the study, we're going to make sense of it in our own particular way, which often says a lot about our own preferences or needs or biases or wants. And to do this, I'm going to stick with the amygdala a little longer. Now, often when you read about mindfulness literature, if you pick up Mindful Magazine, if you read a study, if you read a book, how is the amygdala talked about? You might see it as the fight, flight, freeze response. You might see it as the fear response. Even it's been studied recently in terms of unconscious bias, that when we have an unconscious bias towards other people, that the amygdala has a heightened activation. This could lead us to a very particular understanding of the amygdala, about like, okay, wow, I just need to have, less of that bad amygdala thing going on. It's causing all these problems for me. But there's a really great study that highlighted something else, which is that if you think about the amygdala as something that is part of the salience network, something that helps us detect and mobilize ourselves towards things that are salient, that are important, that are relevant, well, it would make sense then, and the finding has been that the amygdala is also involved in empathy. It's involved in attachment, that sort of sense of connection, especially with a parent or guardian or caregiver. It's associated with trust then. It's associated with pro-social behavior. If this is a network that's detecting things that are salient or important, in principle, we could see why the amygdala might be involved in helping us move towards going to help someone, alerting us, hey, that person over there, they're having some trouble, right? They could use someone to go help them out. And therefore also in morality. alerting us to, that's not right, I need to do something here. The real lesson here is that context really matters. That when we talk about any of the different brain regions, how they function, they increase, they decrease in function, it's important as a teacher to not oversimplify things, to say, well, this type of activity is good or this type of activity is bad categorically, but to be sensitive to the context in which that activity is happening. In some cases, having heightened amygdala activity might actually be a totally appropriate social response. And in other cases, it might be a kind of overreaction in terms of that our mind and body has assessed that there is a threat there, like we think there's a snake on the ground, but it's actually a stick, right? So the context is super important here when you're teaching this science. This ties in closely then when we talk about context, this ties in closely with culture and with bias. All the way on the left there is a picture of René Descartes, one of the kind of seminal thinkers in the Western scientific tradition. He was the guy who said, "I think, therefore I am." And there's this certain priority that the scientific tradition has put on the brain and on thinking and on analytical thinking, in particular, logical analytical thinking. What happens is when that type of culture encounters meditation practice, contemplative practice, it tends to see contemplative practice through that light, right? So it tends to see like, oh, okay, meditation, well, that's really about the brain, and that's about thinking, and that's about how we think. It's actually really interesting. A lot has been written about this that you could go look up. One book in particular is this book called The Birth of Insight that really tracks the history of what happened as contemplative traditions in the East ended up meeting with Europeans, and this kind of intermingling then as the two cultures tried to understand each other. And really interesting story about how basically contemplative traditions, which existed in a certain cultural context, there were certain parts of that got pulled out, and which eventually became the seeds of the kind of modern mindfulness movement that's getting so much press. And the things that got pulled out were things that resonated with the biases and the proclivities of the people who were encountering it. Just to give a contrast to that, there's in the picture in the middle, there's a researcher by the name of Michael Yellowbird who's worked with indigenous peoples and comes from that background, and who has been really important in the field of highlighting the ways that the cultural biases that we come into this science with often informs what we get out of it. So you see here this a header that I pulled from some of his resources, The Brain on Ceremony. The idea here was to say, well, wait a second, like there's all sorts of different practices that different cultures have used in order to shape how we relate to ourselves and how we relate to the world. And for example, ceremony is a big one of those. Why not study, or what if we studied how the brain changes in regard to ceremony? A lot more that we could say there. One of the things, for example, that's coming up more recently, just as of 2019, is, for example, a greater awareness that this sort of scientific, super rationalistic way of thinking has tended to cause mindfulness practice, when taught in Western context in particular, to really focus on the brain and on thinking and on the head, and to leave behind the body, awareness of the body, less emphasis on emotions, less emphasis on things like creativity or intuition, which tend to be more body-based practices. And that's something that's gradually evolving over time as we become more aware of, wait a second, there's this whole other aspect to the practice that has been left behind, not for scientific reasons, although it might have seemed that way at first to the scientists who encountered it, but more because of what people are interested in. Flipping over now to, if you start putting yourself in the teacher's shoes and consider, how would you apply some of this knowledge? Imagine that you had gotten this question then. You show a slide, it highlights certain regions of the brain with certain colors, which is supposed to be showing something, and the participant says, hey, what's going on with those colors in the brain, and how does that show a connection to mind wandering again? If I could actually take a moment and consider, like, what would you say? What is that connection that this slide is making between brain regions and certain types of mental activities? So now, looking at that, you might Remember, this is the default mode network, and this is a network of the brain that scientists previously had found seemed to be active during mind wandering, free association, rumination. Oh, okay, so when scientists wanted to understand how meditation might affect mind wandering, what do? Well, they decided to look at this network. Again, this is making the connection between physical structures of the brain and certain types of cognitive activities. That's the important thing to keep in mind. And what about this question? Imagine a participant asking you, hey, I heard, mindfulness grows the part of your brain that makes decisions. Is that true? And based on everything you've heard so far, how would you think about that? How would you think about responding to that question? Take a moment and consider it. One thing that you might keep in mind is what we talked about with the many-to-many mapping between networks in the brain and functions of cognition and behavior. That it tends to be the case. It's just a very safe assumption to go from that there's not just one part of the brain that's involved in something. The brain is a highly complex, highly interconnected network. And certainly there's no single part of the brain that makes decisions, right? Making a decision is a highly complex process. That's just sort of background awareness that I would suggest you have as a teacher, so as not to get into the simple oversimplification of just like, oh, yep, the decision-making part of the brain, that's going to grow, right? And to be precise, as you think about this question, how you might respond, you might consider, okay, well, what is known about decision-making? What are the factors that influence decision-making? Is there research showing that mindfulness affects structures, functions in the brain that are relevant to making decisions? This is in the spirit of orientation. This is in the spirit of like how you think about the science, how you think about the brain, and the spirit of that then is going to be infused in how you communicate about it. All right, so we are now at our third big topic of this presentation, where does the field of contemplative neuroscience stand, which is really important to know as someone who's teaching about material which is very new and quickly evolving. So this is also a good point for you to take a breath, take a stretch, do anything you need to do to kind of refresh your attention, because there's a lot going on here. So do whatever it is you need to do. And then let's dive in. So there's this great phrase by the legendary investor Warren Buffett who said, if you don't know jewels, know the jeweler. In other words, if you're not super familiar with the subject matter, one of the best things you can do is to know people who really do know the subject matter and who are reliable. And that's really the approach that we take with the science and search inside yourself and propose for you as a teacher. As much as you can, build your expertise on things, but realistically, we're really relying on there being credible, thoughtful, diligent scientists who are doing this work. And so we're going to try and know who are those people who are doing really great, really credible work, and then largely going to be trusting what they're finding and what they're saying in terms of how the field is evolving. Thankfully, the past few years have brought something that didn't exist 10 years ago, and that is meta-analyses. Meta-analyses that are looking across the whole field and saying, okay, there are actually some findings that are starting to stabilize. Mindfulness research isn't more of like the Wild West that it was in the early 2000s of just a little bit here and there, and all the studies were very, very, very limited. You see here a couple of recent meta-analyses cited, as well as the book Altered Traits, which is I see as something as a milestone in the field of having a book which performs something like the function of a meta-analysis, saying, okay, look, there's been a lot of research done over a lot of years now. Let's systematically go through and say, what are the patterns that they're finding? And what these different meta-analyses are pointing to in this rapidly evolving field is that there are some findings which seem to be stabilizing. What are those things? The first is that there is some consensus around some of the benefits and mechanisms of meditation practice. Some of those benefits include things like anxiety, rumination, and depression for different types of meditation practices, as well as changes in the function of three key networks: the salience network, which includes the amygdala, you can think of it like the brain's alarm system, the default mode network, and the central executive network, including the prefrontal cortex. Some of these findings now, there's a sense that changes in these networks have been detected frequently enough that we can say the field stands at a point to say it's pretty reliable to say that changes are happening in these regions when we do certain types of meditation practice. And secondly, there's a growing recognition and appreciation that practice time matters. And if you read the book Altered Traits, they very much structure the whole book around this, saying that there's a big difference between having a very short introduction to a meditation practice to having a sort of medium range introduction to a meditation practice, which is becoming more regular, all the way towards being what they call like the Olympic athletes of meditation practice, people who have done thousands of hours or tens of thousands of hours over a lifetime. That's where a couple of highlights of where the field stands right now. Within that, there are still a lot of challenges that's important to be aware of as you're teaching the science. One is that some claims have outpaced research. And so there's claims you'll occasionally hear pop up in the popular press, and that'll come up in your classroom that say, oh, I heard meditation helps with this or helps with that. Often there's just a big challenge with the media that a scientist might do a really nuanced study that says, well, there's a certain change we might be able to detect under certain conditions. And by the time that reaches someone's blog, it turns into a really big overstated claim. So that's one of the reasons why it's important to really read the studies and to especially read those meta-analyses that say, yeah, this wasn't just one study that one person did somewhere and then the press reported on it and got blown out of proportion. It's really important to stick with what are the findings that have been consistent over time, done through rigorous research. The second thing is that what you see come into the popular press sometimes and even into popular dialogue now more and more, you might hear some of your participants mention it, is some kind of casual usage of things that sound neuroscience-y, but are actually not so much neuroscientific as they are talking about social or cultural desires, expectations, or hopes using parts of the brain. You see this kind of thing like, oh, quiet your overactive amygdala. You'll see things like that in blog posts and in media and magazines and so on. And it's just important to be aware. Again, we did a whole review of the amygdala earlier and what some of the limitations to that kind of thinking could be, right? Like the amygdala is involved in many different things. Context matters. The desire to always be highly self-regulated and very calm, that might be more of a cultural bias than something that is objectively valuable under all situations, even though it sounds scientific because you've used the word amygdala. And it's important to know that while the quality of studies has improved over recent years, the studies are still fairly weak, many of them that are out there. One of the ways I've heard this explained best is that, especially over the past 5 or so years, there are actually more and more high-quality studies of meditation being done. However, there are also more weak studies of meditation being done. So we're very fortunate that there are a lot of great studies in the past few years that didn't exist, say, 8 or 10 years ago. But you just need to be aware if someone sends you a link or a participant in your program says, oh, I heard somewhere that meditation helps with this, that the vast majority of studies that are being done are still fairly weak studies. Where are things going? This will be a sort of last wrap-up of where the field stands. One is researchers being more thoughtful about how do you measure mindfulness. This is one of those things that's a real challenging conceptual question. We can teach a class, we can give some instructions, we can hope participants are following them, but what exactly do we mean by mindfulness? And even in principle, how would you measure that? And is that mindfulness or is that focused attention? And is that mindfulness or is that just being conscientious about your daily routines? Who's teaching and how? Recognition that the quality of the teacher matters. And in many studies, there was no reporting on who was the person teaching it and what was their background. Measurement of adverse experiences. That for some people, especially people who have had traumatic experiences in the past, if you dive in and especially do a longer meditation, a deeper meditation, a less structured meditation, that there are people for whom in that space can come up all sorts of challenging memories or so on. And so this is something that wasn't previously measured or talked about and then is beginning to enter into the research field more and more. And finally, tying back to things we've said earlier, more sensitivity about cultural assumptions. There's a lot of very healthy discussions starting to pop up around when you say that someone is self-regulated. Well, that depends a lot on the context and the conditions in which they live. For example, if you live under highly stressful conditions as an adult or as a child, it's actually quite normal for your nervous system and your brain to have a much faster trigger response to possible threats. We might think of in research saying that, well, the goal should be to be not triggered as easily, but it is important to also be aware that there is a biological reason why, if you're steeped in a certain environment for a long time, your body starts responding to it and habituating to it in a different way. Okay, let's talk then about how. So we've talked about what is the science in Search Inside Yourself, what are some of the fundamental neuroscientific concepts you need to understand. We've talked about where does the field stand, and we started off from the very beginning with why. Like, why did we even have science in the program in the first place? Hopefully all of that has laid a really solid foundation for you to actually start talking about the how, because this how is totally built on top of the why and the what and the where. Once again, we're going to talk about three things in the how. We're going to talk about how to read a scientific study, how to talk about science when you're teaching it, and how to continue to learn more about science. Let's talk about how to read a study. This is something that might seem really intimidating if you haven't read a scientific paper before. But I want to propose to you, just as I said in the very beginning with science being a process for pursuing understanding, that if you get the basics of what is the thought process behind a study, what are the steps that the researchers are taking, it's actually very relatable and very practical. And if you understand that underlying structure, you're also less likely to get thrown off if you don't understand certain technical terms or how they did certain measures or why exactly they did certain things, because you can track the overall journey that they're trying to go on to uncover knowledge. So hopefully this section is going to be very targeted at helping you as you're reading papers and reading studies in preparation to teach Search Inside Yourself. And as I'll highlight later, it's then going to help you to explain the studies clearly. Now, we can think about any scientific investigation as being composed of these steps. How it starts is with a question. What do we want to know? Once we have a question, then we come up with a method. How are we going to investigate that? How are we going to develop knowledge about that? Once we know our method, we have to pick out very specific measures. What are the measurements we're going to use? What tools are we going to use? Is it a thermometer? Is it a survey? Is it an fMRI? Right? We have to pick out the tools that are going to help us do the investigation. Once we take those measures, then we have results. We have data. And we analyze that data. And overall, we see, well, what came out of it? What results were produced? And then there's a final step, the conclusion. And in the conclusion, it's taking what the results show and saying, well, what meaning, what do those results mean? What practical significance do they have for people, for other scientists, for the public, and so on? And what questions further are brought up? Often when we do a study, that you get maybe one small answer and 10 more questions about more things to look into. So I'm going to run through this, and this is a really important thing to understand the real fundamental backbone of as someone who's studying the science. So stick with it, and I really encourage you to follow along and think through the challenges as I share them to you, because that's going to help you really make sense of this material. Imagine this situation. I'm a researcher and I'm undergoing my very first scientific study. I'm very excited. I'm someone who's been doing meditation for a long time, and I recently discovered compassion meditation. And I've had a wonderful experience with compassion meditation. And I say, you know what? I'm a PhD student. I'm doing my first study, and I really want to understand, does meditation improve compassion? Because my meditation teachers are telling me it will, and the books I'm reading are telling me it will, and I have a feeling from doing it myself that it might, but I want to actually investigate that scientifically. Okay, so here we go. Peter's very first PhD research study. What am I going to do? Well, suppose I said my method is I'm going to interview people who are meditators, and I'm going to interview people who are not meditators. And what sort of measure am I going to use? Well, I'm going to do a self-reported compassion questionnaire. So I'm going to hand them a piece of paper that asks different questions like, how compassionate are you? How much do you feel for other people's distress versus how much do you turn away from others who are in distress? Things like this. So suppose I hand out those questionnaires to a whole bunch of meditators and then to a bunch of non-meditators, and I look at the results, and what do I see? Meditators score higher on this compassion questionnaire than non-meditators. Very interesting. And from that, I draw the conclusion, meditation leads to greater compassion. Okay, so let's imagine kind of closed scene on this. This was a first iteration of doing a compassion study. Now, if you look at the study and you look at the conclusion that I came to, that meditation leads to greater compassion, how strong do you feel this process was at coming to that conclusion? What are the limitations that you see in this process which would make this conclusion maybe not as clear or straightforward or reliable as maybe I feel it does after getting to the end of this? Now take a moment and think about that. Okay. Well, there's a lot of different things we could say here, and I'm going to call out just one of them in particular right here. Correlation is not causation. So correlation, the fact that two things are related to each other when we go to measure them, does not mean that one causes the other. A classic example of this is that there's a correlation between ice cream sales and crime rates in cities. When there's more ice cream being sold, the crime rate tends to go up. Now, this is not because ice cream causes people to commit crimes. It's because there's another factor going on, and that's the weather. When it's warmer outside, people tend to buy more ice cream, and when it's warmer outside, people tend to be out and about more, they're bumping into each other, they're interacting more, and so there's more opportunities for crimes to happen. Taking this particular compassion study, someone could look at the work that I had done and say, well, meditation leads to greater compassion. I'm not sure your study shows that. What if more compassionate people choose to become meditators? They were just more compassionate beforehand, and for some reason that makes them want to do meditation. And so, yeah, there's a difference between meditators and non-meditators, but that's just because they were more compassionate to begin with, and more compassionate people like doing meditation. So if I wanted to then make the study stronger, if I wanted to investigate this question with a bit more rigor, then I might come up with an iteration on it. So see if you can follow this now and still pay attention to where does it feel stronger and where might it still need improvement. So let's say now I go to do a training intervention. I have the same question, does meditation improve compassion? And the method I'm going to use now is a little bit different. What I'm going to do is I'm going to measure compassion before and after meditation training. Now, the idea here is that I'm ruling out the possibility that people are just more compassionate to begin with, and that's why they started meditation. I'm making it so that I'm going to do what's often called an intervention. I'm going to do something, take an active step, which I think might make a difference, and then I'm going to do some kind of measurement to see if it will. Measures, I'm going to use that self-reported compassion questionnaire again. What are the results I find? Very interesting. Greater compassion on the survey for those who did the training. And the conclusion? Meditation leads to greater compassion. Great. So I brought these people into a room, had them do a survey. They scored a 4.25 on average in terms of compassion. They did the training. After the training, the average for that group has gone from 4.25 to 4.5. And I say, look at that. Meditation leads to greater compassion. So, once again, if you look at that conclusion and you look back at the process used to gather the knowledge, what do you think? What limitations might still exist in this process? And once again, there's many different things we could say here, and I want to call out one of the bigger ones, and that is the limitations of self-report data. So self-report data is anytime you're asking people to indicate for themselves something about themselves. How good of a driver are you? How good are you at managing your emotions? How self-aware are you? Things like this, right? There's a lot of different limitations to asking people to self-report. One of them is that usually when you bring people in to do a study, they have a hunch about what you're going to study, and they want to help you out as the nice PhD student or researcher, and so there's a sort of tendency to give you the answer that they think you want. The other limitation is that sometimes we're just not great at assessing our own qualities. I might think I'm the world's most compassionate person, and everyone around me would say, "Are you kidding me?" So there's a lot of limitations to self-report data, and you kind of have to take anything with a grain of salt that's asking people to self-report on things like attention and emotion and so on. All right, so then how might I make the study stronger? All right, I'm going out again. This is my third attempt at a study. I'm still asking that same question. I'm still really curious about it. Does meditation improve compassion? My method, I'm going to measure compassion before and after meditation training, so I'm doing the same method as last time. And now I'm going to do something different. In the measures, I'm still going to do that self-reported compassion questionnaire. But then I'm going to do something else. I'm going to do something very clever. I'm going to ask participants to watch videos depicting people who are in some kind of distress. And I'm going to have a little hidden camera that picks up on their facial expressions as they watch these videos. Because I know from other studies that facial expressions tend to be relatively reliable indicators of someone's emotional state, and they're very hard to fake. It's very hard to fake a facial expression. And the idea here then is I'm saying self-report is very limited, so I'm going to use a physiological measure like facial responses. And these are going to be things that help bolster the study because it's more reliable than self-reporting. All right, so what are the results I find? Not only greater compassion in the survey for those who did the meditation training, but also greater likelihood of showing facial expressions of concern. Now, this is really important because I've gone from just a survey self-report to now saying, look, they showed more compassion type facial expressions also. Now, I'm a lot more confident saying that meditation leads to greater compassion because, that facial expression thing is pretty hard to fake. Now, this study's starting to look stronger. And yet, there's one more big step that we could still use to improve it. There's probably a lot of different things we could say about it, but there's one more thing I want to call out for today. The third lesson has to do with ruling out or controlling for other possible explanations. So when you hear talking about controlling for something in general terms in a scientific study, we're talking about ruling that out as an alternative explanation that someone could give for what we're seeing. And in particular, we can talk about, in this example, ruling out something called non-specific training effects. This is a very fancy way of saying that anytime you bring people together to do any kind of training, they get a little bit of a benefit. They've gotten out of the house, they've met a nice facilitator, they've met a group of people, maybe they had a coffee and a bagel afterwards and they chatted with each other. So there's a way that just anytime we go and do any training, we get a little bit of a boost because, we just feel good. We've met someone new. We're learning. Learning feels good. And so someone could look at my study and say, well, Peter, you saw these changes, but maybe it was just the fact that you got people to show up to a training and have more social interactions and so on. They could have been learning how to use Microsoft Excel. It has nothing to do with compassion. It's just you brought people together. That's a training effect that's not specific to compassion. It's a general effect that we see across all kinds of trainings. And this is actually something really serious, by the way. If you think like, oh, come on, that's just some little thing. Non-specific training effects can be significant. They can lead to significant changes in people feeling better on average. So I would say, all right, fine. I still have the energy to pursue this question because I still really care, asking the same question. I'm going to do the same method. However, I'm also going to have a control group, right? I'm going to have a control group that's as similar to the group that is doing the training, a group that's as similar to doing the training as is not doing the training. And so how am I going to do that? Well, I'm going to have them do some other training program. What's that other training program going to be? Well, I'm going to do something that isn't related to compassion, but in all other ways resembles a training program. So you've seen the creation over recent years of something called the Health Improvement Program, or Health Enhancement Program rather. This is something that researchers studying meditation have created as a separate training protocol that is giving knowledge about health. It resembles the meditation training program in all other ways, except they're not learning meditation. They're just learning about how to improve their health. So in this way, what I'm hoping to do is control for or rule out the possibility that the reason I'm seeing differences is just because I've brought people in a room 2 hours a week for 8 weeks and that makes people feel better. Do the same measures. And what do I find? Much more robust results now. Let's say I still find greater compassion in the survey, greater likelihood of facial expressions of concern, and that increase in facial expressions of concern, that only happens for my compassion training group, and it does not happen for the control group that's just learning health information. And then I say, meditation leads to greater compassion. That then is a much more robust finding. Now, I'm highlighting this for two reasons. One is so that as you go ahead and start to read more studies, you're able to understand what is the journey that the researchers are going on to discover new knowledge. Question, method, measures, results, conclusion. Another reason that's important is so as you're teaching all of these, really complicated studies in the program, that you understand why scientists are going through the trouble of doing all these things, right? Well, why using, MRI in the first place? Why don't we just let people, write on a survey how they feel? Or why, what is this control group thing? And why do we have to do that? It's not just happening for no reason or because scientists like being needlessly complicated. It serves a real purpose at helping to be more and more rigorous about the conclusions that we're drawing, that we're making. So just to summarize, here's the 3-step process we just went through in improving on my original study. First, because correlation is not causation, we did an experimental study. We did a training intervention. So we didn't just survey people out there in the wild, we actually had them do something and then tried to see if the people who did the training were different after the training as compared to before the training. And second, because self-report is limited, that self-report questionnaire is limited, we use multiple measures, and in particular, we use some physiological measures which are hard to fake and can help control for or rule out some of those limitations of self-reported data. Finally, because there are different possible explanations that can come up whenever you do a training program, one of the big ones being non-specific training effects. In my final study, I added this control group, which was similar in all ways to the training group, except that they were not learning meditation, they were just learning health information, and that helped control for other possible explanations. As you go ahead and read studies, I really encourage you to use this framework and be tracking it as you read about it. Okay, what is the question that they're asking? Get that really clear first before you dive into the weeds. What are the scientists studying here, and why does it matter? And then as much as you can, try and understand the method. The method often involves doing some kind of a training program or protocol, which you as a facilitator are familiar with what that's like. And it might also involve certain time periods where we survey or collect different types of data. Now, when you get into the measures, sometimes here things can get a little complicated because many of the measures can be very technical, right? You might not know the particular procedure that's used to analyze the fMRI data. You'll see a lot of acronyms used for the types of questionnaires or measures that are given. That's because scientists put a lot of work into the specific way and order and type of question you ask makes a really big difference. And so there are researchers who spend their whole careers just finding reliable ways to measure things, reliable surveys to give out. So don't get too worried if you have a hard time tracking the specifics here. My encouragement as you're getting started is to at least try and understand the intent. Okay, so they're giving something called the 5 Facets Mindfulness Questionnaire, FFMQ. Okay, and that's a survey that's intended to assess mindfulness. Okay, got it. If you can just get at that level, what's the measure they're using and what is it supposed to do? That's a good enough starting point. And then in general, if it's from a peer-reviewed journal and it's from a trustworthy researcher, as a starting point, you can just trust, okay, that's going to do what it says it does. Down the road, you can always investigate that more, and is that a good measure, or should a different measure have been used? But that's a good place to start. The results, my first suggestion is to look at the graphs. Often the graphs are the most immediate visual way to get an impression of what the results are. The authors of the paper will tend to simplify it down and make it very concrete. This bar is bigger than that bar, meaning that there was an increase in something. This line went up, that line went down. Really simple first impression. But then it's worthwhile, once you've read those graphs, to actually read the results and how they talk about them to be sure you're getting any needed nuance about it. And then you can read the conclusion. And in the conclusion is where you see the researchers making an interpretation of what they found. And a thing to pay attention for here is that there's a lot of factors that can come in when we go to interpret results, and a really good scientist will be very careful about what they claim, right? These findings, are these applicable to all people or only people with certain conditions, like people under high conditions of stress? Reading the conclusion, once you get to that part of the paper, is a good way to understand how a good researcher ties it all together and makes reasonable inferences. Just a couple of points then, how to talk about science once you have read the study. These are just a few pointers to keep in mind. First, read and understand the study summaries that are provided to you as part of your teacher training materials, and in particular, note the limitations. No study can single-handedly give conclusive proof of anything, so it's neither appropriate nor necessary to try to say that any study fully explains any given phenomena. So just understand this study did this, here are the strengths to it, and here may be the limitations to it also. Second is, when you're teaching a piece of science, try to cite the author's name in particular. What is the name of the author or researcher who did this? What's the university or institute that they're associated with? And this is a way not only to give credit to the people who did the work, but also to not have to put yourself in the position of saying that this is a subject matter that you're totally fluent in, but instead that you really are relying on the credibility and rigor of someone at a reputable university or center who's submitted this to a peer-reviewed journal, and that there's a whole process that built this piece of knowledge. Third, the phrase provides evidence rather than proves. This is just a good practice. Proof is a very, very high standard. You'll usually hear scientists talk about providing evidence for something. And finally, acknowledge what you understand and what you don't understand. And I just find in teaching, it helps if you do the background knowledge, you understand the scientific studies as much as you can. When it comes time to teach it, that you get used to separating out what parts you can speak to and what parts you can't, and don't feel you have to speak to the parts you don't understand. For example, if you're sharing a picture of a slide that shows a change in a brain before and after doing some training program, and someone asks you, how exactly did they find that change? What was the method they used exactly? You might find as a teacher that you say, well, gee, I understand the general process they went through. I understand they measured the brains beforehand, then there was a training program, and then they measured the brains afterwards, but I don't actually know all the specifics of how that study was conducted or what neuroimaging tool was used. That's okay. It's best to know as much as you can, but in that moment when you need to explain something, it's better to separate out what you do know and don't know. And if you don't know something, that's why you have the author's name and the study reference there in your materials, that you can always look it up later or point the participant to it if they want to explore more. I'll add one last one that has to do with citing the author's name at university, especially when a challenge comes up. Please don't say, "Science says blank." That's something that you see from time to time, someone saying, "Science says that this is good for you," or "Science says that this is bad for you." It's important to know that science is not a person. Science is not capable of conducting research on its own as an abstract idea. It's certain people, certain researchers who conduct things. And being really precise and rigorous about this is important for credibility and for your integrity as a teacher. In talking about science, this is a three-part structure that I like to think of when I'm thinking about how to teach a study. First, I've read the study, I've gone through that whole structure of question, method, measures, results, conclusions. And once I understand that then, and I'm thinking about communicating it, I might think of it in these terms. I might say, okay, what is the role that this study plays in the program? Why at this particular moment, as we talk about, say, self-awareness or emotions, what is the role that this study plays? And first being really clear on that. Am I talking about a mechanism? Am I sharing this in order to explain to the audience, here's how something works? Am I talking about a benefit? Am I trying to make the case that this is a credible practice that you should try out? So whatever it is, just being really clear on the role that it plays in the program will help you in communication. The second then is knowing, how does it play that role? This is going to play the role of showing how, for example, the brain works when we have an emotional trigger come up. How does it play that role? Okay, well, it explains the mechanism and explains how when one thing happens, then in the amygdala, then there's downregulation of executive centers. And so explaining that dynamic is going to help my audience connect the dots themselves about when they're triggered, they often have a harder time doing long-term thinking and clear decision making, right? So that's how the study is helping do that. And then the real winner is if you can tell it as a story. And storytelling is a skill that you'll see throughout Search Inside Yourself teacher training. The basic idea is that people tend to remember stories better than they remember abstract facts. This is the real cherry on top benefit of having done that process of reading a study through the lens of the structure that I provided, because what you'll notice is that structure is a form of story. Scientists had a question. They wanted to know something. So what did they do? They thought of a way to measure it. Here's how they did that. What were the results? Well, something surprised them. This happened instead of that. And when you can tell a study in that way through a study, not just being this kind of intimidating thing of science saying something, but as people who wanted to know something and went through a process to get there, and hey, what did they find out? That's something that's a lot easier for people to understand, and it's a lot more fun to talk about as well. We're getting towards the end of the how. We've talked about how to read a study, how to talk about science, and finally some parting words on how to learn more. For as long as you're teaching Search Inside Yourself or being a kind of public ambassador to the work that's being done in contemplative neuroscience, which is one role that you're playing. You're taking knowledge which is being done in the academic realm and sharing it to the public more broadly. So as long as you're doing that, it is, of course, really important to keep up a practice of building your understanding and staying on top of where things are. Very similar to how it's important to keep practicing your facilitation skills and keep having a meditation practice. So here's a few top recommendations. Aside from reading the studies, there's a lot of great audiobooks that you can find which are hugely, hugely helpful. And for those of you who have commutes or who travel a lot, Audible is my favorite. There's a lot of other ones out there. In particular, you can find these books on there called the Great Courses, where it could be like 13 hours or 16 hours all on emotional intelligence, or all on the science of mindfulness, or all on whatever. And these are really great. They're done by highly respected field experts, and they'll give you a real in-depth knowledge. Same is true for TED Talks. If you look at most of the authors and the major works that are cited in the Search Inside Yourself program, You can just Google that person's name plus TED Talk, and you can probably find them giving a TED Talk about what they've studied. There are two benefits to doing these. The first and most obvious one is that you'll understand their content better. The second and less obvious one is that if you listen to a lot of these over time, you'll also understand how a scientist talks about science. And that's really important. There's certain ways that they present the results to try to make them relevant, to make them easy to understand, yet also not going too far and overstating claims or overgeneralizing about things. As you start to watch a lot of these, you'll start to get a feel for how a professional researcher or professional scientist talks about their own work, and those can be lessons that you take into your own teaching. So to recap, this has been an orientation to Science in the Search Inside Yourself program. We've talked about why science and search inside yourself. We've talked about what's in there and what are some of the fundamental assumptions about talking about the connection between meditation practice and the brain. We've talked about where does the field stand, how this is a rapidly evolving field which has changed dramatically in the last 5, 10, 15 years and which is probably going to keep changing dramatically in the future. So continuing to stay on top of that as a teacher. And finally, we've talked about how. The real important how to read a study in a really structured way. So please go back and revisit that section as much as you need as you start reading the studies in the program. How to talk about science, some different tips for that, and then how to keep learning more. Thanks for joining me, and I wish you the best on your journey of becoming a teacher and continuing to be a scientist.